Hello and welcome to Conversations in Horror. It is good to be back in 2025. I am your host, Kevin L. Powers. I am also the owner and operator of Something Wicked Film Festival and Events, and welcome to our podcast. Now, if you are new to the podcast, I just want you to know that this podcast is dedicated to everything horror, from classic horror films from the 1930s and 40s to more modern ones in the 80s and 90s, and even some more recent ones. Over the last years since we've been doing the podcast, we've kind of delved into a lot of different films from a lot of different eras and even genres. So if you're coming to the podcast for the very first time, we've done some comedy horrors, we've done some found footage horrors, we've done all kinds of horror, and we are glad to be bringing this back to you for another exciting year. So with that, my special guest for today is Sarah Panazzo. We want to welcome her back after this glorious first year.
Oh my gosh, it's been so long.
It has been a little bit long. We took a little bit of a break there due to some personal issues, but we're so glad to be right back in the swing of things. And we're going to be taking a look at a lot more horror this year and a lot more risque and controversial and all kinds of horror in between. So this is going to be a very exciting year for the podcast. So to get us started, we're actually doing an oldie but a goodie. We are going back to 1935 and looking at The Bride of Frankenstein from director James Wells. The thing is that we don't delve into this era that often, but it's always a good thing to allow our audiences to get a look at some of these classic horror films that they may or may not have seen and or heard of. I know there is a lot of talk right now about this movie being remade, so it's a great time to go ahead and delve into the classic film, even though we haven't even touched upon the original Frankenstein film. But
I mean, it's a great time for classics in general. Nosferatu came out. You've got Maggie Gyllenhaal doing this. You've got Guillermo del Toro doing Frankenstein. The Wolfman just came out after Lee Whannell did Invisible Man. So we are slowly getting a lot of stuff.
So, yeah, so we want you to, all of our listeners out there, we want you to go out there and delve back into the classics that made these iconic creations, and we'll start off with Bride of Frankenstein. So as usual, I like to always ask my special guests for the show a little bit about their first time watching the film or their experience with the film, something like that. So Panazzo, what is it about this film that got you the first time you watched it, or makes it one of your favorite or not so favorite films now?
So I think I was originally introduced to the character of the bride much earlier than I saw the movie, because I don't remember seeing the movie, but I remember seeing her as a cartoon on like Scooby-Doo, or I mean, like, you've got like the Munsters and stuff like that. You've always had these characters who are based on her character. I mean, she's one of the most iconic women of horror, especially for Universal Monsters. So I think I knew who she was before I saw the movie, and then it was one of those times where like it popped up on Turner Classic Movies or something where it was just like kind of running in the background, and I started paying more attention. But yeah, she's just such a huge figure for such a small role, like small screen time. She is just so iconic.
Yeah. So for me, I had not watched these movies, did not grow up with these films, because I hate to say this, growing up, I kind of avoided black and white movies. So I actually did not see this movie until college, when I was tasked with following a single director and going through his filmography. And so my topic was James Well. I don't know why. Don't ask me why. Probably Gods and Monsters had come out or something. I don't know why I picked up on him, or I decided to do a paper on him. And I decided I had to watch all of his films. So I watched Frankenstein, Bride of Frankenstein, Invisible Man, Showboat. I just kept going. I had to watch all of these for this paper. Bride of Frankenstein ended up being the one I loved the most out of all of them. So this is the one, and that's very rare for me to like a sequel better than the original. But Bride of Frankenstein is my favorite out of all the Universal horror films. And you're right, it's one of the most iconic monsters, despite the fact she has very little screen time, and there are no sequels with her in it.
Yeah, but no, you've hit the nail right on the head. Like, everyone says, like, this is the finest of all Gothic horror movies, and it is Whale's masterpiece. But everybody always says, like, there are no sequels that are ever as good as the original, and this is the biggest argument against that. It did phenomenally at like the box office. I mean, you can see how long it's held up and stood the test of time. It's still an icon. It's still referenced in a ton of stuff, like in Bride of Chucky. I mean, even Poor Things with Emma Stone is kind of loosely based on it. So it definitely is one of those most iconic of all time. I think it's been on like AFI and Rolling Stone's like top 100 or 500 most influential movies of all time.
Mm-hmm.
So it's done it.
And one of the things I liked about this film, and it's in a lot of James Whale films, but this one in particular is the way he uses the horror and the sci-fi and the comedy all
Oh my God.
integrated into this film. It's exceptionally, or especially, sorry, get my words mixed up, especially with the Dr. Pretorius character, who I absolutely love as a mad scientist in this movie. I cannot say enough. He reminds me of the character in, oh my God, I can't think of Reanimator, the doctor whose head get chopped off and he's flying. I can't remember the doctor's name.
See, I was laughing from the like first two lines of this movie, not necessarily the opening scene where they're like doing the prologue with the authors, but as soon as the lady shows up with the crazy ass hair,
Yes.
and the one guy just turns to her and goes, "Just shut up." I was like, "Oh, okay." And then she had a bunch of great one-liners, and then everybody else had great one-liners. I mean, the influence this also had on Young Frankenstein, like you can't go the entire blind hermit scene without thinking of Gene Hackman and that whole scene. And I kept thinking something similar would happen, and I was like, oh yeah, no, I'm not watching that movie.
Now, I think that character's name is Una, the old lady who has all the great one-liners throughout the
Oh
whole
my
movie.
God.
It is really. I think she may even be an iconic type of caricature for future horror films, because you always have that type of person who has this. It's like comic relief, but not really, because she's not a main character and she's not a secondary character, which
Yeah.
is where you would normally get your comic relief from. She's just a bystander who keeps popping up in scenes and delivering these one-liners that just stick.
Well, and it's funny because she's kind of like the creepy old man who warns them not to go to the cabin in
Yes.
the woods. She's constantly warning everybody, like, yo, he's coming. And then at one point she runs into him and she's like, well, fuck it.
Now, you mentioned something briefly earlier, which is the opening scene, which kind of sets the tone for this movie.
Yes.
Because it is Mary Shelley and the rest of them, that whole group, Mary Shelley, her
Lord Byron, Percy
Byron.
Shelley.
Yes, them all together in there that night where they all come up with these iconic stories that would be everyone has heard the story. It was also depicted in the movie Gothic. But these four creative people, and Mary Shelley comes up with the ideal behind Frankenstein, or the modern day Prometheus, and they do that in this movie to set up that there is more to the story than what she had originally written down.
Because I remember I had to read Frankenstein in high school, and I was like, oh, there is so much more to this. And like, you missed the whole thing with like the monster being able to speak and being like a functioning human being. And so I love the way that they adjust the movie and the characters to do that with this. And the fact that she was like, oh no, there's more to the story. There was a bride. Like,
well, the thing I like about this is because I think at this time Will had I guess a little bit of carte blanche to do a sequel, and he didn't want to do the same thing he did in the first one. Plus, his personality lends itself to this. I can't remember when The Invisible Man was released, but The Invisible Man has this like macabre sense of humor, just like it, but it doesn't mix the science as well as the horror like I would have liked, which is why The Invisible Man, as much as I love that movie, is not my favorite of these films, but it's still an awesome movie. But this film seems to have mixed it all together.
Yeah, because he said he didn't think it was going to top it, so he wanted to make it a memorable hoot.
A memorable hoot. Really? That's
Yes.
funny. That is funny. Oh my god. I actually wish I can go back and reread that freaking paper I wrote about him because I can't remember everything I wrote. But I know going through all of his films, I would not have been. I probably did read some stuff about this. I have a book about him and his whole oeuvre of films. Read it way too long ago. I don't remember much
Hmm.
of it, but he's an iconic director from that era. So you gotta have a book about him.
Yeah, it was funny. Another one of the things I saw was that he had mixed feelings of him just kind of being put into horror because he wanted to be an A-list director and he lists some random director's name who nobody knows about anymore. And everyone's like, if he could see him now, he would be very impressed with his work.
Yeah, I think so too. I think it's just the time period of which these came out. They were low budget and they made a lot of money for
Hmm.
early Universal Studios, and they just kept churning them out until, of course, the cycle ended, and then they stopped making
Hmm.
them for a while.
Yeah, and I mean with the limitations they had, like I know this one wasn't nearly as violent as the first one because they had, I forgot what it was, like the code something, where you
The
could only
Hays
show
Code.
maybe where you could only show a certain number of deaths on screen, which is why a bunch of the deaths in the movie like happen off screen and then you see their bodies later. Um, but yeah, and then like the whole subtext of certain scenes and how he wrote certain things, like you make some like references to God or like Christianity now in movies, people are like, okay, I get it. He's a Christ-like figure. Whereas back then it was like, dude, what the hell are you doing? Plus you're gay. Like, you watch yourself.
Yeah, I can't remember if he was. I don't think he was out when he did this.
He was openly gay because he had met his partner a few movies before this or
Oh,
before Frankenstein, I think. Um, but yeah, I fell deep down the rabbit hole of like, is there subtext? Was he trying to say something? Was he just putting in what he knew based on his history of being like lower middle class? Was it because he was gay? Um, so much stuff that could possibly be subtext. And his partner was like, no, he made art to make art. But then a lot of it does kind of equal out near the end of like, okay, it kind of makes sense if you do look at it this way versus this way. But we can get into that later. That's a whole thing.
so the other thing is with this one, and I do not believe. I think the cast changes for the third film, but I believe this is the last film where the majority of the cast from the original one returns, and the next
Yes.
one, everyone pretty much is different.
Yeah, it's
Um,
just the monster and then everybody else is completely different, I believe.
okay, because I couldn't remember if Boris Karloff played them again for the
He
next.
did. It was the last time he played.
Okay,
Yeah.
those details. I to be honest with you, I only watched repeatedly Frankenstein and Bride of Frankenstein. The rest of them I don't really watch unless I have a lot of time to just go through and watch the entire franchise all at once. And then of course Bride of Frankenstein, I watch that by itself all the time.
Yeah.
But I always question myself like that because that's a huge thing with these sequels, even back then because they didn't do sequels that often, and Whale was able to use the same cast as he did for the first one. Now after that, obviously they just started getting cheaper and cheaper, and the budget started getting lower and lower, and
Yeah, I saw a really funny joke where somebody was like, yeah, like how in today's day and age we've got like Twister and then Twisters where it's a dollar sign at the end, or it's like Twister 2, Electric Boogaloo, but Bride of Blank and Daughter of Blank tended to be like those kinds of sequels. So it's really interesting that this is like still the one exception of like, no, this is like a phenomenal sequel.
yeah, yeah. Yeah, and it's unfortunate that we horror fans are not given our sequels to the horror fans that we love are not giving the bigger budgets to expand upon them. Sometimes they are, that's,
Yeah.
but it's good that back in the 30s and 40s that they hadn't gone completely, what do you call it, jaded. But I would like to say that this cycle did not last very long. They kind of
No.
turned them out really fast. They died fast. And then, of course, like you said, in the 70s or 80s, a lot of these films were resurrected because back then they didn't have video or anything like that. The only way you would have seen them is in the theater. So
Yeah, and it's interesting how we've hit that edge of the cycle again, where we're now getting all of the movies again with a little more subtext or expansion on stories based on more research done on the creators. So it's definitely an interesting time.
Hmm. So going back directly to the movie,
Hmm.
I want to know, like I already told you, Dr. Pretorius is one of my favorite characters, because if I was going to be a mad scientist, I would be that mad scientist. Uh,
Yes.
you look at me like I'm crazy.
No.
There's fun to be had in being a mad scientist, but this is a guy who created life, but they're all miniatures. So I love that aspect of this movie, and I know that when I saw this in college, I was wondering how the hell did they do those type of effects back then?
Yeah, it's very impressive seeing how it still looks really well done.
Yep, yep. So I don't know about you, but what was one of your favorite characters in this film, particularly? Were you a Frankenstein, the monster, Bride of Frankenstein?
I'm not sure because the bride is so short-lived in the entire thing. It's hard to say she's my favorite character because she doesn't really exist until the end.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but until then, I don't think I had a favorite character necessarily, but the whole world of the movie was just well done from like the miniatures to the set pieces to the special effects. Looking back on that and being like, oh, this was like 90 years ago this year. Like, this is so impressive that it still holds up. It still looks really well done. And just the care that was taken with it.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So, I had a question and I completely forgot because I was too busy listening to you. Sometimes that happens.
I know.
Oh, so, one of the things I want to talk about in regards to this film is the fact that, oh my God, I'm completely went a blank on this film, and I never go blank on this film. But the thing is, Bride of Frankenstein. Oh, now I know it. The thing about Bride of Frankenstein, and this character who doesn't really exist as much in the story. The idea that her existence in the story is to appease the monster who just
Mhm.
feels alone in the story. So it makes this film a more sympathetic film for the monster. The first film, you don't feel as much sympathy, because of course, he wants revenge on Dr. Frankenstein. But by this film, Dr. Frankenstein doesn't even want to make a monster, and he feels guilty about what he's created. So he feels almost obligated to build this monster a mate so that he will no
Yeah.
longer feel lonely. That's one of the things I took from this film that, I really thought made elevated it, is the word, elevated it above just being a horror movie, because they could have simply just made a movie about the monster killing people in the town and being chased around the town, but they added that dimension to it, and it ends, for me, Dr. Pretorius ends up being the true villain of the film.
Yeah, so I've got a little bit of a tangent about all of this.
Okay.
So, and it kind of ties into what I was going to talk to you about Pretorius. But yeah, I like that it went back to the tragic character of the monster or the creature from Mary Shelley's book, where he was a very sympathetic character. He was basically a toddler who was learning about the world and was being punished and shunned for reasons that were no control of his own. Um, and everybody forgets with Frankenstein and Bride of Frankenstein that he is extremely violent, like killing people, throwing people off of cliffs and into windmills and all the other fun stuff. But like, you lose that entire sympathetic character from the book. And with Pretorius's character, they kind of brought the version of him or that part of him back into the movie. So you get a lot of those conversations, and I didn't realize it until after the movie, um, where I was doing a little bit of research. But like, he's compares himself to that devil in the bottle. And I had to think for a second. I was like, wait a second. In the novel, Frankenstein refers to him as the devil or the demon for most of the book. And then later on, the monster ends up saying he should have been Frankenstein's Adam or perfect creature, but was instead made to be Frankenstein's Satan. and cast out and hated despite the fact that he never sinned. So I love that it was like a little bit of a tongue in cheek, like this is that aspect of the evil character who wants to do the bad, whereas the creature in this ultimately wants to do what is right when he starts learning
Yeah.
like how to speak and how to do things, where he tries to protect the blind hermit instead of letting the guards attack him or whatever. But I thought that it was a very interesting take and going back to the original story.
Interesting. Okay. I will have to go with you on that. It's been a long time since I read Frankenstein.
Yeah.
A long time. Yeah. So you know what? It's good. It might be good for me to go back and revisit that one. You know, just to get the idea of the original story, because over the years, with so many different adaptations, my interpretation of what the story was or originally was is completely shrouded by all the different.
Yeah, because all of them have completely different endings. Like none of them are exactly the same. Because you get like the De Niro one where Helena Bonham Carter dies and they resurrect her and then she kills herself. Or you get like the ones where it's like, well, it's over. I guess there's nothing. And then what was the other one?
There's a whole bunch of modern day ones.
Yeah, there's like the 85 one where she falls in love with him later after being resurrected. I mean, there's so many different, like Lisa Frankenstein. I mean, hell, they both die and then they become like zombie people together.
Oh my god. Well, we can always talk about I Frankenstein or what is it, Victor Frankenstein?
I don't even remember I Frankenstein. I remember seeing it, but I do not remember anything about that movie.
I don't remember anything either. There was gargoyles. I think they're gargoyles. That's all I remember.
I think the closest I've gotten to this, besides like Pretty Things or Good Things or whatever it's called, is Penny Dreadful. Their first season actually really tied very well into this.
Yes.
Because they kind of slipped they made it an entire subplot of the show.
Yeah.
So I thought that was also really well done. I didn't like the show itself, but I did like the way that one was done.
I love that show. Went some crazy ways, and they didn't get to finish the show, which is sad. But yeah, I used to love that show. So all right. So I'm thinking of more stuff about Bride of Frankenstein, other than the fact that of all of the Universal horror films, I've already said that this is one of my favorites, but I want to kind of reiterate to a lot of people who are listening to the podcast that these films, these black and white films, these films from the 30s and 40s are not films to be afraid to actually experience. Like, I know a lot of my friends have never seen any of these films because they're in black and white. Mm-hmm. That is so hard for me to hear sometimes because there are so many great classic black and white films that have been made that are timeless. And I see not only this film, but most all of the original Universal Studios horror films as classic movies that everyone can enjoy, even though they're mostly rated G because that's about all they had back then. I think anyone can enjoy these films, and they should be enjoyed, and they should be shared with audiences, even as we are getting tons and tons of modern interpretations like Lisa Frankenstein's or remakes, which we will see pretty soon from Universal. Yeah.
Well, and I mean, like, Universal now has like the horror mini theme park where they've got all of them they've always had like the older Universal monsters roaming around the park, especially for like Halloween horror nights, and they've had haunted houses based on them. But now they're having like an actual full theme park just dedicated to them.
Yeah.
So like
very interesting for me. Hopefully I'll be able to get out there and see it one day.
Yeah, because it's like, this is how influential you've been. You've made a freaking theme park. I know it only took Harry Potter like 10 years and Star Wars like 40 years to make theme parks, but like Universal's kind of had them for a long time. And now that horror's making its big comeback, they're like, yeah, let's do a theme park. Yeah. I'm here for it.
Which brings up another thing. Horror in general is, I know, looked down upon by a lot of people, but horror is also one of the more profitable genres, theatrically speaking. I mean, as much as Lisa Frankenstein was diversive, I'm sure it will eventually become a cult classic. Now, personally, I didn't really care for the movie, but I could understand how other people did like the movie. It just wasn't my cup of tea. Nosferatu has already broken all kinds of freaking records. I can see that movie. That movie's winning awards already. I'm like, dude, it's a horror movie, and that
It
doesn't happen.
deserves it. It's like when The Exorcist didn't win anything, or Silence of the Lambs. Like, I think it was like Anthony Hopkins won, and that was it.
So,
Like,
those type of things don't come along that often, and it's because so many people look down upon horror. But classic horror films like this can show audiences how the genre has progressed. These were monster films that terrorized the audiences of that era. Now, you may look at them now and laugh at some of the crude set pieces or stuff like that, but this is stuff that was beyond what they were doing, what they could do back then. They were breaking new boundaries. They were breaking taboos. Like you said, they had to be very clever with some of the storytelling because I think it was the Hays Code. I think it was called the Hays Codes. They had all these freaking rules that they had to follow. And we don't have those kind of rules now. It's creative freedom now, pretty much. With Terrifier 3, everything's creative freedom.
well, and that's like one of the big things I've always said is like the reason why I think horror is like one of the best genres is the original stories that you can come up with. Like, what other genre has an entire tornado full of sharks? Like, you don't get in your action movies, they all tend to follow like the same kind of thing. It's always like, okay, save the girl or rob the millionaire or whatever else. We're going on a special mission. But with horror, it could be so different with every single film. And like we've said multiple times before, there are so many genres mixed in with it, from Western to musical to comedy to romance. It's crazy. And a lot of these like older ones go back into the gothic horror, which is completely different than regular horror. Because like I remember people going to see Crimson Peak and they were like, this is disappointing. I thought it was horror. And it's like, no, it's gothic horror. It's like super old school, like pre everything we worry about. That shit didn't even exist at that point. So like you're worrying about creepy shadows in the hallways. You're back to the original senses of foreboding and terror that caused bumps in the night. Like, you're not afraid of like the masked killer who's going to come in and slaughter an entire town, because that wasn't really a thing that happened back then. And when it did, it created the werewolf or the vampire.
Yes. So, with that, are there any other words you would like to say about the Bride of Frankenstein? Because I have some that have to do in the wider scheme of things.
Yeah, I have so many like notes on like just cool effects and stuff like that.
Yes.
I mean, the movie as a whole, like we've said, is really funny. It can be like heart-wrenching in some scenes, just seeing the difference of how people as a whole can act towards one person based on how they look or whatever else, which was very ahead of its time. But it has a lot of stuff to say without openly saying it. And for the 30s, it's not a like movie for pure entertainment. It was actually, as much as he said he wanted to make it a hoot, it was done quite lovingly.
Yes. And if you watch any of Wells' other films, you'll realize that he has a lot of fun with whatever genre he decides to tackle. I had to watch a lot of different films of his for my college paper. A college paper, yeah, it's almost like a thesis paper. I think it was 20, 30 pages long. But he was someone who tackled every project with the utmost care and respect, while also being an artist and delving into things that most people had never done before. So that's what I have to say about his work. In regards
I
to
think his background in like theater, as coming from like a stage manager, set designer, and builder to being a full theater director to then doing movies, definitely helped with that, because you hear all these stories about how he had input on the lighting, had input on the sets, which is more of what people do now compared to back then, where it was like, okay, well, they do that and they do that. He wanted an all-around aesthetic.
Yeah, let's try to teach all that to the newer generation now. So, This being our return to 2025 with our conversation in horror, and we're starting off with a classic. I want you all, the audience out there, I want you all who are listening to make sure to take the time out to look for and discover some of these amazing classic horror films, not just the ones from Universal, also the ones from Val Lewton, also the ones from Hammer Studios. Hammer, even though a lot of their black and white films were a lot of thrillers back then, they were still amazing thrillers because they until their cycle of monster movies came out, they did a ton of great thrillers back then. The ideal is that we want you to go out there and to check them out. We don't want them to be forgotten. We don't want them to be buried underneath a blanket of dust. We want you to discover these films, to tell your friends, tell your other film enthusiasts, tell everybody, because we have to keep these films alive and in the consciousness, not only of other filmmakers, but also of film fans as well. I want to thank you, Panazzo, for joining me for this episode of Conversations of Horror. We're going to be doing some more of these classic horror films throughout the year, so be on the lookout for that. And on another note, make sure to support our podcast by subscribing, liking, leaving us notes. If you have any type of horror films you would like us to tackle that we haven't already, please let us know that, because we'll add them to our list and we'll force people like Panazzo to watch them, no matter how obscure or crazy they are. She's very willing to do that.
Oh, yeah.
But yes, thank you so much for listening. Conversations of Horror 2025. We have a lot in store for you. Everyone out there, from us, have a good day. Conversations in Horror is a Broken Lighthouse Pictures production, written, produced, and directed by Kevin L. Powers, executive producer Kelly A. Inoka. All contents and material from this episode of Conversations in Horror is copyright 2025 Broken Lighthouse Pictures.